Well, yeah, I think anxiety is a really good subject to cover because let's be blunt, it's something that all of us at any stage in our lives have at some point. And of course, it's one of our emotions. Um, and I think a good start point is actually to consider why we have anxiety and why it feels so unpleasant. Um, and if we consider what anxiety is do we essentially do we have the coping resources to deal with a threat? In competition, that's really easy to look at. You know, what's the threat? Are we prepared for it? But let's just backtrack slightly and look at why anxiety may exist, you know, rather than thinking it's horrible having these emotions that don't feel very nice. There's probably a reason for it. And I think the first thing is to look at the feeling of anxiety. Is I think we'd all universally accept it's not very pleasant to feel. And if we think why that may be, it's probably, in simple terms, because we need to notice it. And actually, it's a big enough shout that it makes us do something about it. If it was a wishy-washy emotion that we could ignore, we may well ignore it, and then we wouldn't deal with the threat that's in front of us. So if we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, of course, and we can say, well, thank God we do have anxiety because it's actually one of the things that keeps us alive. And then if we look at it, and if you consider that from the perspective of, you know, 40,000 years ago, we're walking down a path and there's something on that path in front of us, and we're immediately alerted to that and we jump back because we don't know whether that's a snake or a stick. We don't know if it's benign or whether it's going to potentially finish our lives off and our ability to pass on our genes. We have that immediate reaction to move back, and then that's our primary assessment, is there's something here. And then our secondary assessment is, hang on, what actually is there? Okay, is it a snake? Is it a snake I can that may kill me? Okay, I might move away from it. Is it a snake I might want to eat? I might kill it. Or is it a stick? I might use it for a walking stick. So we have that primary and that secondary assessment. And of course, the reason anxiety feels so nasty, and similarly with fear, is it wants us to do something about it to keep ourselves alive. So it's that, and once we acknowledge that, then anxiety starts to be something you go, okay, so actually it's telling me to do something. So anxiety, and I use it with my athletes. Okay, you're feeling anxious, great. What's the threat and what are we going to do about it? So then we can start to look absolutely at what the threat is. And if we look and say what the real definition is do I have the coping resources to deal with this threat? So of course that needs two things. It needs us to look at what the threat is, which is, let's be blunt, as sports people, it's something we're choosing to do of our own volition. And then going, great, okay, so now I'm going to resource myself so I can deal with that as well as possible. And getting that understanding of what anxiety is about is really, really important. And of course, it lessens it, because I get so many people coming and saying, I want my anxiety to go away. I don't like it. But actually, when we see it just as a function of being a tool that's designed to keep us alive long enough, if you like, to be able to propagate, to pass on our genes so that, you know, we get a new baby Hustis in the future at some point, because of what that's done for us in the past. So anxiety around competition, or competitive anxiety, is probably made up of three things. How our body feels, what thoughts we have, and the level of confidence that we have. And if we consider how our bodies feel around anxiety, what would be the things that you might notice, Phil, yourself, when you're anxious? What things would you get?
A slight change in heart rate, butterflies in the stomach, sweating maybe as well. The kind of, I guess, that feeling or thought that you might need to fight or flight is the kind of the obvious answer. But yeah, it's that feeling that you know something might need to happen.
Something might need to happen.
Arousal states up, I suppose, is the fancy way of saying it.
Yeah, and what you've described, so you've talked about increased heart rate, increased breathing, increased sweating. And again, one of the things I'd always look at with my athletes and say, okay, so until we've put any meaning on that, they could just as easily reflect excitement. So, you know, if you're excited about something, yeah, your heart rate may rise. You know, you might find that actually your breathing changes. You might find you get so excited you're sweating, and actually you might find that there's that feeling something's going to happen here. So again, anxiety can become very, very akin to excitement, and recognizing that those things, and it's only then the perception that we put on that determines whether that's anxiety or excitement. They're very, very, if you like, they're two sides of the coin. One is the positive, one is the negative in terms of how it feels, but what our bodies are doing by and large are very, 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 very similar. And then of course we look at the thought. So, okay, what is the threat? And that can be the, you know, that's the thought and the worry and the things that happen. I don't want to be here. I don't like the feeling. But what I try and get people to do is get that discrimination from, is it the feeling I don't like, or is it the thing that's actually threatening me I don't like? So making that distinction, because of course we don't like the feeling of anxiety. We want it to go away. So do we avoid doing something to avoid the anxiety, or do we avoid doing something because we can't cope with what that challenge is? And again, my view would be in sport is we arrive at a competition at least partially ready to meet the challenge of competition. I mean, that's your job as a coach, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
You know, so
we've not done our job then, have we?
Exactly. And you know, and that's the job of actually making those challenges doable. So when we put challenges in the way of our athletes, we pretty much want to make sure that they're achievable challenges. We might not win every time, but we should have the capacity to finish an event, and we should have the capacity to finish an event. And so again, we can start to go, hang on, what is the actual challenge in front of you? You know, what's causing the anxiety? But getting that distinction, because what's interesting is how many people don't do things because of anxiety when they're things they've chosen they want to do. So getting that distinction between the decision making based on avoiding the feeling or the actual challenge itself is very, very important. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess the question I have immediately then is that for many people, that threat is almost a dent to their ego or a dent to their self-confidence, rather than, especially in a racing environment, if they don't do well or they don't do what they want to do, it doesn't make a difference. It's not going to hurt them. It's just going to hurt and damage their ego rather than anything else.
Yeah, so that's a really lovely point. There's a whole swathe, by the way, of anxiety based around what we call impression management, which is the impression that we think we're giving to other people, you know, whether that be a coach, whether that be a potential girlfriend or boyfriend or a selector, whatever it may be. But the cause of that, but absolutely what you're rightly saying there is a lot of that is a threat to our ego. And once we can get past the ability to be embarrassed, we're probably moving quite a long way forward. And I would say that also becomes important, because if actually our fear is whether or not we look silly, if I'm using the right, you know, the right wording, or we don't look good, or we don't manage to achieve something, that can be very damaging to performance, because it can stop us getting to that raggedy line of where we may succeed or fail. And most people I've worked with who have been very, very good at sport, they can be very, very good, but they're probably not that much better than everybody else, that they can win and it's easy and they've got lots in the bag. You probably need to be as close as you can be to what you're capable of doing to be the best at something. And whatever level we're working at, that holds true. And if actually what we're doing is working within ourselves to avoid threatening our ego, we're obviously never actually getting the most out of ourselves, which is a really important part of how anxiety can impact on us indirectly.
And I guess that affects as well the confidence in being able to push on, which is obviously your third point on anxiety. If you're never going to be willing to put yourself in a position where it might be classed as, using your word, silly, then you're either going to stay in that realms where you feel quite confident about everything, that comfort zone, or you're just never going to go in an area where you're going to, go and damage that self-confidence or damage that ego or anything along that side of things.
Well, quite.
About being silly.
That's really well put, and we look at where confidence comes from, and probably there's three areas where we get confidence, and one is the innate confidence we have. One is the evidence that we have around us of what we've actually been able to do. And the third thing is what people who actually mean something to us let us know that they think we can do, so we want that. But of course, if actually all of our evidence is of operating within our comfort zone, we're not building the evidence that we can operate outside of that, and almost that ability to get to the stage where it's okay to be uncomfortable, and we get comfortable operating in a zone where we are uncomfortable, oddly enough, then changes our relationship with anxiety, because we know that it's okay to be there. And if we think about it, I think people often have a false belief around anxiety that states that I need to feel good to perform well. And when they see the anxiety sat there, that then tells them they don't feel good. So then they think they can't perform well. And if we investigate that, that's obviously a false premise. There's nothing that says you have to feel good to perform well. You just have to do the stuff that underpins you performing well. Your performance doesn't matter. And I know that for a fact by the amount of elite performers that I've seen performing extraordinarily well, and knowing from conversations with them how they may feel building up to an event. But once we put that in the way of ourselves, that can stop us performing at all, because we're saying, I need to feel great to perform well. Well, actually, it's very natural to feel anxiety before something that threatens our ego or threatens our ability to do stuff. So getting past some of these false premises is a really, really important part. And of course, once we understand that and we start to perform feeling uncomfortable, oddly enough, we then tend to start to feel less and less anxious about it anyway, because we know that we don't need to worry about the anxiety, and where we can end up if we're not careful is people worry about being worried rather than about what's in front of them.
I guess there's two things which fall straight out of that. The first one is the idea that reframing the whole situation is saying, when was the last time you did a race or you did something and you didn't feel anxious, you didn't feel like you weren't great, and what was the outcome? You've done well, you've managed to do it. So kind of calling back, and I think something you said on a previous occasion, when was the last time you were perfectly ready for a race and everything was 100%? It's never the case. So we know that you can perform without feeling great. And then the second point, I think, is just that back to basics and fundamentals. Once you've started something, so the top of a roller coaster or top of a big slide or something, your nerves are at the beginning, but once you've done it, or once you've made that first step, you've just fall into, in the case of a roller coaster or a slide,
Really?
Gravity. But in reality, you're just falling into your routine, your bit. And I know golfers and baseballers have a pre-shot routine, pre-hit routine to try and get them in the mode, so that when they start doing the motion or the movements, it's all automatic. There's no thought process in it which can get in the way.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And there's a couple of things that sit in there. What we know about anxiety is it tends to peak a little bit before we actually start. So generally, once we're in the performance itself, it tends to drop quite significantly. And I bet if you ask most of your athletes, they would tell you the same. Yeah, it feels horrible the night before, and then there's a period where actually it feels okay, and then I'm into it and it really feels okay. And then afterwards I wondered what all the worry was about. But there's also that part about how we actually consider the challenge in front of us. And if we think about it and make it too big, then it can be something that anxiety can get in the way of. But actually it's about almost priming the things that we do, that we know we're capable of doing, and making the things that we have to do small enough. So actually, if we looked at a racer, okay, can I put my wetsuit on? Can I dive into the water? Can I swim this stroke? can I swim this stroke at this level of intensity? Okay, can I get back out? Can I take my wetsuit off? You know, and of course they all become things that are challenges, but absolutely you can do them all. And that knowledge that actually it's just these small processes all added together that can create the whole challenge. You don't have to do the whole challenge at once. You just have to do the little bit that's directly in front of you, which is eminently doable.
And I guess it's different to say, let's just take golf as an example. You know, a golfer stands in front of the ball anywhere between 65 and 75 if they're any good as a professional, times in a round. They do that 4 rounds in a competition. So they have 60 to 70 attempts every day in that competition where they're going to feel anxious, and this next shot will make a difference to how they're going. Whereas with an endurance athlete, you've only got 1 race a month, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but in reality 2 times a year max, maybe 3 times, where the event really makes a difference and is really, really important. So unless you stop in a transition and you start thinking about the next bit and you get overwhelmed by that, in reality, you get very few opportunities to practice overcoming that anxiety, and very few opportunities to demonstrate that you've overcome it.
You do. And so let's just talk about the golfer first. So one of the things, and you mentioned that before, is what you're absolutely doing is you're priming behavior. You don't mechanically think through a golf shot, you prime it so the right things happen. And again, you know, I think if we looked at practice and we say, what's practice about, which, you know, athletes do a ratio massively more of practice to competition, you know, particularly endurance athletes and particularly very long endurance athletes. So what we know then is we need to think what the purpose of practice is around that. So it's absolutely about, have we got the physiology right? It's absolutely about, have we got the mental skills right in terms of what I do? But it's also absolutely about how we start to pressure test that and make sure that we can perform those skills in different conditions, and that we can make those transitions and we can start to pressure proof that. So in essence, if you think about what anxiety actually does to us, and we have a processing capacity. So whilst me and you are talking now, we've got all the knowledge in our brains, which in your case is colossal, but it's everything that you've ever learned and anything that's ever gone in there. And while we're talking, we're using our attention, which has got very limited capacity. And we probably have the capacity to hold about 7 bits of information plus or minus 2 in our working memories, so in our attention. And it's thought that anxiety impacts on that, or the worry side of anxiety impacts on that, in the fact that it takes up space. So it's, you know, it's using up space in our working memory. Now, what we can do with that is we can pressure test our ability to work with other things going on, i.e., so we're using up space. So we're reflecting what anxiety does to us in some of the training that we do. So if your training is all done at very lovely, softly, gentle levels of loading, don't expect there to be a great crossover into performance. So we've got to make sure that some of the training is absolutely geared around developing technique. Some of the training's developed around the physiology. Some of the training is developed around making sure that there's a higher bandwidth in the training than we might expect in competition. Then actually, when people get to competition, we might not be able to replicate the anxiety of competition exactly, because of course they're different challenges, but we can replicate and above the amount of load that someone is able to operate under. And if we recognize that that's actually what anxiety is doing to our attention, then we can set stuff up so that, and not all the time, you know, maybe 1 in 5 sessions, or as we come into competition, a little bit of pressure proofing, so that we know that stuff is working for us. You know, so again, yeah, you look at what's in front of you in the calendar and you make sure that your training reflects those challenges in front of you. And if you like, in the same way as the physiology is a challenge and the ability to pedal for a distance is a challenge and keep good poise and posture, the ability to deal with the impact of negative thoughts, lack of confidence, all of those things are things that you make sure you overcome over a training program.